Hi there, I'm Matt Hayes, Head of Real Estate here at Harrison Clark Rickabees, and welcome to the latest of our series of Ask the Expert webinars. Today I'm here with Claire Day. She's a partner in our commercial property team and specialises in real estate finance, and Ben Thomas, partner in our real estate team in Cheltenham. Afternoon, guys.
Afternoon.
Hello.
So today, 24th of June, it's the quarter day for commercial tenants, and there will be billions of pounds expected by commercial landlords to be paid over today in payment of commercial rents. Well, clearly we're encountering the most difficult of circumstances for landlords and tenants alike. And I just wanted to ask you, Claire, can you tell us about your experience with some of your clients who have portfolios of retail outlets and how they're managing, particularly on such a difficult day such as today when the quarter's rent is due?
Yes, of course. I think generally it's pretty obvious that any tenant across any sector has struggled since the COVID lockdown was announced in March. I think the difference with retail is that whereas office-based tenants may have adapted by enforcing home working across their workforce to enable cash flow to continue, the retailers have suffered forced closures, which has resulted in furloughing of staff, lack of cash flow, lack of income coming in, but they're also still faced with the rental liabilities and potentially mortgage payments, which weren't necessarily going to go away. So we did see a lot of inquiries coming in at the start of lockdown where tenants were wanting to know what was available in terms of relief for them, which was obviously before the government intervened.
Yeah, no, it's been a very tough time for retail. And Ben, just talking more generally about the tenant position in the commercial property market, what's been your experience?
Yeah, well, that's right. Just mirroring what Claire said, really. I think the problem on the high street and elsewhere, even before COVID, was that tenants were struggling, retailers were struggling, the Amazon effect, high business rates, people were struggling anyway. And so COVID has come along and has accelerated the issues for everyone. So I think this is where it's been a real issue for everyone, not just retailers. And so, as you said, it's the second quarter day since this all kicked off, and there's real problems out there.
Absolutely, Ben, and just increased pressure, day to day. I suppose what would be useful for some of our tenant clients out there is just to understand, what's in the tool bag for landlords. I mean, what redress can landlords seek against tenants who are perhaps unable to pay their rent, or worse still, at risk of some kind of insolvency? Ben, could you pick up on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think in the normal course of events, landlords have various paths that they can take. So they could issue insolvency proceedings against a tenant. They could issue forfeiture proceedings. They could they may have some form of security in place, such as a rent deposit deed, where they've taken a rent deposit from the tenant at the start of the lease, and they could look to make a deduction from that. They could potentially pursue a guarantor if the tenant has a guarantor, or even a former tenant under an authorised guarantee agreement. They could issue standard court proceedings, or they could take a different method, such as commercial rent arrears recovery, which would be sort of to take steps to recover or take control the tenant's goods and sell them in order to recover the arrears. I think what's different now, of course, is the government has brought in restrictions on some of those remedies.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I mean, I suppose the biggest threat that tenants face, I suppose the ultimate threat is is landlord depriving them of their ability to trade from their commercial premises. Clearly significant political and economic pressure to keep commercial premises open, to keep businesses going. Can you just outline some of the steps that the government has taken to intervene really, and to try and come to the rescue of tenants against perhaps more aggressive landlords?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, it's the second quarter day today since this all kicked off. The first was the 25th of March when it was very early on in the lockdown. And so straight away the government jumped on things and announced that there was going to be a suspension on the ability for a landlord to take forfeiture proceedings against a tenant for non-payment of rent. And so they put a stop on that until the 30th of June. Now, just a few days ago, we've heard that they've now extended that date to the 30th of September, which is the day after the next quarter day. So tenants are safe to some extent from landlords taking that course of action. Another thing that they've now announced is an extension of the suspension on landlords being able to serve a statutory demand or take winding up proceedings against tenants. And that was up until the 30th of June, but it's been announced that then you're not going to be able to do that until the 30th of September. They've also made a change to the commercial rent arrears recovery procedure, and they've extended the number of days that a tenant is in arrears before you can look to take action under that as well. So all of that plays into the hands of tenants more so than landlords. The other announcement that's just come out is they've brought in a suggested, it's not a mandatory, it's a voluntary code of conduct, which landlords and tenants are, it's suggested that they look to follow going forward. It's in place now for the next year up until June 2021. Now, I suppose the question on that is, will landlords and tenants follow it? There's been other codes, there's been leasing codes in the past, which they're advisory, but they're not mandatory. And this is just for now a government's proposal for parties to follow that.
So Ben, just to clarify, the main essence and thread in the code then is for landlords and tenants to behave in a particular way?
Yeah, that's right. It's proposed that they act in a collaborative way, using and acting in good faith, reasonable and fair, all the sort of usual words you'd expect to hear. And to some extent, I think a lot of tenants and landlords have been doing that. You know, it's not just happened yesterday. This has been going on a while now. We were advising very early on that really what people had to do was, yes, okay, check their leases or other documents, but then pick up the phone to their landlords and their tenants, because everyone's, going through, it's unprecedented times. Nobody's quite sure how long this is going to last. And so we just need to we're all in the same boat, I suppose. And I think that's even quoted in the guidance with the code is, we're all in the same boat. Let's do what we can to help each other get through this. The landlords still want tenants to be occupying their properties, at the end of all of this. They don't want to be lumbered with the rates and the utilities and the security arrangements for the property. And tenants, likewise, they want their businesses to survive, and they want to be back in there and trading. So it's, we're all in it together. Let's do what we can. Tenants who can pay, that not every business is affected by COVID-19. And I think, if they can pay, they should be paying still. They shouldn't use it as an excuse. But those who can't pay, I think they're expected to provide a bit of evidence and backup for why they can't pay, and then come to an arrangement whereby money can flow, basically.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ben. I think a collaborative and common sense approach, really, both to kind of protect the long-term interests of tenants, which is of course what the landlords want, but also to protect the landlord's own investment interests. And that may not be just their own, it may be other parties involved in that, and perhaps we'll talk about that in a little while. So just moving on from that thread of discussion and collaboration, Claire, I wonder if you'd mind just telling us about some of the arrangements you've seen coming into play and how you've had to go about implementing those for your clients.
Yeah, sure. So as Ben alluded to at the start of the lockdown, which was announced in March, we saw an influx of queries from landlords and tenants. Many landlords were simply being told by tenants that they weren't going to be paying the March quarter rent. So the impact was being felt immediately once the lockdown was announced. So we picked up a glut of instructions from both landlords and tenants to review leases, to look at possible re-gears, so options available of maybe taking out certain provisions in a lease, for example, a tenant break option, in lieu of the tenant receiving a rent holiday or rent-free period. That was obviously needing to be documented properly to make sure that that took legal effect. So we were instrumental in sorting out quite a lot of deeds variations for tenants and landlords to document that. One of the other options available to tenants, which we didn't see so much of, but certainly there was an uptake, were negotiating surrenders with landlords. The downside of that for tenants was that landlords would inevitably want something in return for the surrender by way of a financial premium. Now, clearly, if you've got a tenant who is struggling financially, that's not always going to be a viable option. So for those that could make the figures work, there was the opportunity potentially to buy themselves out of lease liabilities. And then the other option, which we've done and continue to do currently, are lease extensions. So again, where landlords are open to suggestions, we've been putting forward the possibility of a tenant extending their lease term, so giving the landlord more certainty in terms of rental income going forward, and in return the tenant would get a rent-free period. Again, the danger with that is making sure that it is properly documented, because it's not just a straightforward variation of a lease, and you need to be very careful when you're varying the term of a lease that you don't inadvertently create a surrender of the existing lease and creation of a new lease, which could then trigger stamp duty land tax liabilities.
So to some extent, we are both looking at the short-term position and trying to create some grace and some ability for survival in some cases in the short term, but also looking more towards the long term. And I suppose from a landlord investment point of view in commercial property, that's very often what's in sight. So and that's interesting. I've had a number of similar sort of instructions. I suppose on the other hand, whilst those are fairly formal arrangements to implement, Ben, have you been advising on perhaps slightly more informal measures that could be taken between landlords and tenants in the current circumstances?
Yeah, I have. So what I've been seeing is more so sort of side letters, really. I mean, we always recommend that there's some kind of documentation put in place rather than just informal arrangements, but certainly side letters where maybe you're changing the payment structure from quarterly payments to monthly payments to help with the cash flow. And it's a relatively easy fix. We've got standard side letters that we use, but which sort of make it clear that it's a personal arrangement. It's not binding on either party's successor in title. which again protects the landlord's investment. And yeah, that's something that I've seen a lot of recently. I think we'll see a lot more of that in the coming months as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So talked a bit about tenants really, and trying to help tenants get through a tough time. I suppose there are two sides to this, as with most things, and it's a tough time for landlords, and there must be some real implications and growing pressures on landlords with portfolios of commercial property who are all being faced with the suggestion of rent concessions, rent reductions, and what have you. What's been your experience, Claire, in terms of from the landlord's perspective, in terms of pressures that are mounting?
Yes, I think if you speak to a lot of landlords, they'll tell you how aggrieved they feel, because they feel that the government intervention has just been so tenant focused that it leaves them with very little, very few options to make sure that they've got that rent roll coming in. One of the first phone calls I took after lockdown was a student accommodation provider who, as you can imagine, was hit pretty severely for the March quarter rents, when all the students just up and left because they didn't want to be sitting in student accommodation when the universities were closed and wanted to be at home with their families. So that's just one example of portfolios of particular type of property that was badly affected. Again, it goes back to that collaborative approach and speaking to tenants, and I think going forward you will probably find that tenants will be paying something. It's not just a case that tenants will completely withhold their rent, but nevertheless I think a lot of landlords feel that they've been left with very little armoury in terms of being able to enforce payments against tenants.
Yeah, Claire, and perhaps a lot of commercial property is significantly geared, and there's debt involved, and presumably, whilst there will be political pressure on the banks to give some grace, the pressure to make loan repayments will be mounting on landlords, surely.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think another option available for landlords is to speak to lenders, because obviously if they don't have the rents coming in, they're going to struggle with mortgage payments. The Financial Conduct Authority has issued guidance for lenders to again bring in that collaborative approach in the same way that the code for commercial landlords and tenants have been brought in. So again, it all boils down to lenders speaking with their borrowers to work out what they can actually afford. Now, one of the options available to many of the borrowers or landlords is to request payment holidays. But it's really important for borrowers or landlords to be aware that that is all it is. It's actually deferring payment. It's not actually free money. And at some point they are going to have to pay that back. Potentially at the end of a payment holiday, their mortgage repayments will increase. So it's all information that the borrower needs to be armed with before they go and simply request a mortgage holiday, thinking that it'll just give them 3 months grace, because as I say, it is just deferring the problem, and they are better paying something rather than nothing. Once that 3-month holiday period comes to an end, there's a lot of pressure on lenders to, again, look at other options if borrowers need those options going forward. So potentially another payment holiday, or maybe waiving or reducing interest payments, or simply just switching the borrower to an alternative product that might work out financially more beneficial for the borrower. So there are certainly options available. And in addition as well, the government intervention, government business intervention loan scheme, the CBILS scheme, which has been significant in assisting businesses. But again, it goes back to that point that it's a loan, and these companies are getting more and more in debt. So, I think we have to acknowledge there's no ideal situation, and both tenants and landlords alike are going to be faced with financial struggles going forward.
Thanks, I think that's absolutely right. And whilst we're looking at short-term questions around rent. I think in a number of sectors, rental values will certainly be looked at very hard, and they will change as we go forward. We've talked a lot about landlord and tenant relationships. I just wonder, Ben, whether you can just give us a bit of an insight as to how things are going just generally in the commercial property market, and whether we're seeing a pickup in activity in the last few months, and what you see as the kind of direction of travel generally.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's no doubt about it. When the lockdown happened, everything went on hold really initially. That level of uncertainty, people just didn't know what was going on. There was the stop on the residential market, so it went a bit quiet without a doubt. What we're seeing, though, there's been a number of announcements by Boris and the cabinet, which have made a difference. Really, there was the reopening of the residential market, which made a big difference. There was just that shift, I think, in consciousness where people started to do things, and we saw that in my team certainly, and matters that were on hold, suddenly I had an option and a lease where they just wanted to get on with it. It was just the difference. I think some people have been bored and they just wanted to get on with things. There's opportunities for some people who've got the cash there, and now we're seeing that agents are carrying out valuations and surveys, as long as they're keeping to all the guidelines. So I'm seeing a pickup in activity, and I think we are throughout the real estate team.
Yes, certainly those are the indications. We're having a very strong pickup in the last few weeks, and clearly pleasing to see that. I imagine there will be some valuation corrections that will corrective activity, which we'll see as we go, and often that's driven by lenders and lender valuations. Claire, you're right at the cutting edge of real estate finance. Can you just talk to us a little bit about lender attitude and the amount of activity that's going on in the lending market for real estate?
Yes, of course. So there's no doubt about it. Property finance work just fell off a cliff once the government lockdown was announced. I think lenders faced three issues. The first issue was actually getting valuers out to properties to physically value them, and whether they were then going to accept desktop valuations, which aren't quite as good. I think that had an impact then on the types of products that were available to borrowers, because the increased risk in not being able to get physical valuations meant that lenders were increasing their loan to values. So borrowers were being expected to put more money in, their own money, at a time where things were very uncertain. So that was the first issue that we were faced with. The second issue was that any valuations that perhaps had just made it in before lockdown were carrying what is referred to as a material uncertainty clause. And this was a clause that was introduced by the RICS, the governing body for surveyors, to basically protect the position of surveyors, because nobody knew what the market would do and the impact that coronavirus would have on the property market. So valuers were putting this caveat in all of their valuations. And at the outset of this pandemic, lenders didn't really know what to do with this clause that was being put in the valuations, because it just created so much uncertainty. And then I think the third issue is the lender's appetite and for risk, because obviously they're going to want to make sure that the borrower can repay the mortgage and has the means to do that. And clearly, if you're lending in particular sectors such as retail, that suddenly became quite an unattractive proposition. So that's where we were. I'd echo Ben's comments, and things have certainly picked up now that physical valuations can resume. The house buying market is back up and running. Development sites and construction sites are now open again. So banks are very much coming back into the market. The loan to values are being reduced again. So we're starting to see this shift back to a bit of normality, I suppose, in terms of the level of workflows that we've got coming through. I think going forward, banks, we're still seeing the valuations, these material uncertainty clauses, but banks seem to have taken that and that they understand that, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens in the property market. But it's certainly something that banks have been able to get comfortable with. How long these clauses in valuations will last for will very much depend on the market and how quickly that market can pick up, I think. But certainly we're seeing a lot of new finance instructions coming through, and banks do now have more of an appetite to lend. So hopefully that will continue.
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, my experience recently has been that our poor old relationship managers and relationship directors within the banks have been working flat out right the way through this recent period, just in terms of business recovery loans, in terms of bounce back loans, and just looking after those of their customers who have been struggling. The idea of doing new business and new business for growth has been kind of second priority in my experience. Having said that, I think recently there is a pipeline building of new finance deals, which kind of suggests to me that there will be a resumption of quite significant activity going forward. Very interesting times. Lots and lots of people working in different ways, commercial property being put to different use. This is something that we, as a firm, have been thinking about before COVID-19, just in terms of how people are going to use workspace and commercial property going forward into the future, in particular in relation to offices like ourselves. Looking ahead, I mean, it's early days, but do you think we can anticipate, Ben, fundamental changes in terms of how commercial property will be used, how workspaces will be used in the coming few years?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's a short-term, long-term sort of issue, really. I think in the short term, what you're going to find is, most people are still under the on the hook, for their leases, so they're not necessarily going to be able to change the workspace that they've got. And will they have the funds to, carry out a complete fit out straight after to change the workspaces? Well, I don't know. They're going to have to change them to some extent to comply with the guidelines of return to work, and we've been through that recently, and we're all working out of the same offices, but they look quite different right now. So it's interesting, and I think we've really sort of taken the bull by the horns in that sense. I think what we'll see is what COVID-19 and the pandemic has done is it's opened people's eyes to whether or not they can work from home. And I think a lot of people have been surprised that actually they can. It's been forced on them, but they've been able to work from home. Now, each person has a different experience with it, whether you've got kids or family at home. It's quite distracting. I think people will actually come the end of this welcome getting back into the office, but there's no doubt that there's going to be a different way of working. There will probably be more flexible working. There could be an end to the sort of not standard 9 to 5, which may be a good thing. It could be the end of rush hours as we know it. So people have probably found that they can work in a flexible way to fit around their personal and family lives. But obviously in the line of work that we do, clients are the priority, and you work as much or as little as you can to do that. So I think in terms of workspaces, there will be a change. There's probably going to be instead of your standard sort of traditional office setup, you're going to have a return to, or not even a return, a sort of a change where you're going to have collaborative spaces, team working spaces, a bit more emphasis on the sort of social side and kitchen spaces. But as I say, that's probably over the longer term, because businesses just aren't going to have the funds to do complete fit outs straight away.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and certainly reducing the amount of space you occupy, it comes straight off your overheads as a business, and we'll see businesses looking to do that if possible. How about in the retail sector, Claire? I mean, that was a sector that has been struggling for some period of time. Do you see significant change in the retail sector?
Yes, I mean, you can't help feeling sorry for those in retail at the moment. Like you say, they took a bit of a bashing pre-COVID, so this really has kind of highlighted the issues that they're all being faced with currently. I think, it will emerge, retail will emerge. I think you've only got to look at some of the statistics that are coming out since Boris opened non-essential retailers, and people are wanting to get back into the shops, despite having been reliant on online retail over the last three months or so. There is a desire to actually go and visit shops physically. So I think it will emerge, but I think there's no doubt that it will emerge in a different form. I think coupled with that, you will have potentially a reluctance for people to travel distances to go and shop. I think that can only be a good thing for the smaller, more local traders, maybe the independents who might benefit from that. And I think also there is potentially still a reluctance from consumers to shop in enclosed spaces. So again, that may impact on shopping malls and larger precincts where consumers may want to be shopping out in the open air. So it might actually sort of put some energy and life back into the high street, which was obviously desperately needed pre-COVID-19. We've also seen a decline in big household names. That's been going on for several years, but even more recently, since the COVID pandemic, we've seen lots of them falling by the wayside, and I think that will sadly continue. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with the rental values for retail space, because if there isn't the demand there, then inevitably the rental values will decline, and then landlords are going to have problems trying to work out what to do with these spaces. So there's lots of questions, and it's going to be really interesting to see how retail takes shape over the next 12 to 18 months.
Certainly there will be pressure on rental values for retail tenants, but not only that, there is mounting pressure for a wholesale government review on business rates, which of course creates further and additional pressure on retail tenants. It's a changing time. I'm sure if we're sat here in 2 or 3 months' time, there will have been more developments that we can catch up on and update on. But for now, I think we're going to leave it there. I do really appreciate both your time. Ben Thomas, partner in our Cheltenham office, and Claire Day, Head of Real Estate Finance. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.